Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for this webinar about advocating for your community. My name is Ryan Gilman. I'm the Senior Associate for Public Policy and Advocacy at the Community Action Partnership. And this is part of a civic engagement webinar series that we've been doing this summer. The first one was sort of like a 101 overview. And then we also did a webinar about voter registration and engaging voters in your community. This one is about advocating, and we're also going to go over some lobbying rules. And then we have two additional webinars coming up in September and October. One's going to be on the census and redistricting, and then one is going to be about voting rights. So we're really excited to have you all here. I'm joined today, very excited by Lindsay Marsh, who's our Census Project Senior Associate, and Lauren Martin, who's a Program Associate for us at the partnership. And then we're also going to hear from CAPLAW, Veronica Zhang and Jonathan Cohn are joining us, and from Bolder Advocacy, Jen Powis. So I just want to go over real quick what we're going to be covering today. CAPLAW is going to go over some lobbying rules and sort of like the difference between advocacy and lobbying. And then we're going to hear from Jen on building advocacy campaigns. And then we're going to go over some next steps for you to take in your communities, as well as some resources, and we'll take some questions. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Veronica and John to talk about lobbying rules.
Great. Thanks so much, Ryan and team, and thank you for having us join the webinar today. We're excited to be here. CAPLAW, as most of you know, is the national partner in the Community Action Network that serves as the legal advisors to the network. And in an election year, we have gotten a lot of questions around both lobbying as well as community action agencies being involved in advocacy at various levels, whether that be directly with candidates or with issues. And so to sort of kick us off here, you've got 4 lawyers on the line, and so what better time than to ask the question, what is lobbying? When we're talking about advocacy, lobbying, education, these words are often used interchangeably in our speech and in the ways that we talk about being an effective communicator on behalf of our communities, especially for the low-income families who live in our communities. And that's critical to the mission of community action. It's critical to this time that we live in right now. But it is important to start off at the outset by talking about what lobbying constitutes, because that will really drive some of the rules that dictate how you go about lobbying. And I just want to say at the outset that even though we're using the word lobbying here, and the webinar series is about advocacy and civic engagement in general, what we want to communicate today is that even if it is lobbying, that is, under certain circumstances, an allowable activity for community action agencies to engage in. And that's really important, that you don't just try to avoid the word lobbying, as I think many in the network are used to doing, because of out of fear or concern that that might not be an allowable activity. So to start off, we're thinking about a spectrum of activities here. On the left, we've got education, and on the right, we've got lobbying. And there's this, again, whole host of activities that one could do to try to convince someone to take a particular position on an issue. And when we're thinking about education, we're often talking about information that affect issues and programs, but do not address specific legislation. On the other hand, when we're talking about lobbying, we're really talking about activities that are attempting to influence the passage of legislation. That includes substantive legislation like bills on Medicaid or immigration, the current COVID-19 relief package that's in Congress right now. Those are legislation that have been proposed, but it could also be legislation that you're seeking to enact or to get a legislature to put on the table. Legislation also includes referenda or ballot initiatives. So these are not matters that are necessarily before a legislature, a federal, state, or local legislature, but policy questions that the general public has input into. And so that would be considered lobbying as well if the activity that you're trying to promote is designed to influence the enactment or modification of that legislation. And then at the very end, we've got a couple of other types of initiatives that sometimes aren't often, thought about when it comes to lobbying. And these are regulations that are passed by agencies, whether at the federal, state, or local level, administrative actions that are taken by those agencies, and then something that's been in the news often is executive orders, whether that be signed by your governor, your state governor, or by the president. We put these in brackets because it depends on the statute that you're looking at and the rules that govern your funding source, but some rules define lobbying and legislation as including these types of provisions. And so, for example, the Federal Appropriations Act covers activities that are designed to influence federal regulations and state and local regulations as well as executive orders. And so just because it's not something that's pending in the legislature or something that the general public is voting on doesn't necessarily mean that it's not legislation. When it comes to lobbying, again, the actions and the activity itself is more important than the label that you provide to it. And so as long as it's pertaining to that type of legislation, we would treat that as lobbying. And because community action agencies are subject to rules that govern federal funding, we at CAPLAW always recommend that if you are taking action on legislation, that you think of that as lobbying. So again, just because it's lobbying and you call it lobbying doesn't mean that it's an activity that community action agencies can't engage in. So if you go to the next slide, our really key takeaway for today in CAPLAW's portion of the slides is that community action agencies can and should consider using unrestricted funds, non-federal funds, to engage in some portion of lobbying activities. Often this is the most effective way to communicate your message to your community or to your state legislatures or federal legislatures, as well as to the public at large. And the key here is that there are rules that govern how you lobby and what you need to do in terms of reporting on your lobbying activities. And that's what we're going to be covering in this section. So the primary rule that applies to nonprofit community action agencies, as well as public community action agencies, is that you have to use non-federal unrestricted funds to lobby. We'll talk about the reason for this in a second, but if you have any funding that can be set aside to pay either a portion of an executive director's salary, or if you have someone at the agency who is sort of charged with or designated as being the advocacy person at your organization, certain equipment that you're using to conduct lobbying, it's good to have some of this set aside for some of your advocacy strategies. The second is that even if you don't, so say your organization does not have any non-federal or unrestricted funds, individual community action agency employees can also lobby on personal time, so long as you're not using the organization's name, the organization's resources, your title at the organization, that would suggest that you're lobbying on behalf of the organization. Individuals have the right to speak up for the issues that they care about. And lobbying on personal time, even if you're an exempt employee, which means if you're a salaried employee, you might think, well, I don't have any time off the clock. But we would say that exempt employees as well can make it clear that they are not speaking on behalf of their organization and that they're lobbying on a particular issue or legislation in their individual capacity. A third way to lobby is, again, if you don't have unrestricted funds to do so, is to consider deploying your board members, your clients, and volunteers to lobby on your behalf. Again, if these are folks who are not being paid by the agency to conduct lobbying and their expenses aren't being reimbursed by the organization to conduct that lobbying, then those board members have freedom to speak up on behalf of issues that your agency cares about. And it often is a really good way of sort of rallying those in your community behind the mission of the organization and to really promote the organization as well. What you just have to make sure you're doing is that you're not using any agency resources to support those lobbying activities. And then lastly, if you do lobby, whether it's directly through staff members or through others at your agency, like volunteers. The important thing is to keep track of your lobbying activities. That's going to be important for reporting purposes, as we'll talk about in a later slide. And you want to be able to document that none of the federal funds that you received were used in those lobbying efforts. If we can go to the next slide. We'll talk more about some of the IRS tax rules that apply to nonprofit organizations. But for nonprofit CAAs, what you have to do is you have to ensure that legislative lobbying is not substantial, and you do have to report it in some form on your Form 990, which is filed annually with the IRS. John will talk a little bit more about the substantial part test that applies to nonprofit community action agencies. For both public and nonprofit CAAs, you want to check your state and local lobbying rules to ensure that you're not running afoul of any of the rules in your state. And then finally, we would say that community action is fortunate to have an organization that is dedicated to lobbying efforts. And so that's NCAF. And if you are lobbying in your state, or lobbying your federal legislatures, that coordinating those lobbying efforts with NCAF can go a long way to ensure that the message is aligned, and also that NCAF can also work the relationships that it has on the Hill as well. The next slide, please. When you're thinking about lobbying rules, we're thinking really about three different buckets. And Ryan, you can go ahead and advance all three. You're thinking about federal grant rules, as well as tax law rules and state and local rules. I've covered some of this already, but I just want to highlight a few pieces in the federal grant law column. Generally speaking, for lobbying, your federal award statute often doesn't speak to lobbying. So, for example, the federal CSBG Act and Head Start Acts don't explicitly discuss lobbying, but lobbying is restricted for CSBG and Head Start funding because of federal appropriations acts, which have annually contained riders that essentially prohibit a large swath of lobbying activities. And so if you're just going to your CSBG Act and your Head Start Act, you might not see any restriction there, but just know that those restrictions are coming from other sources of law, such as the Federal Appropriations Act. The Uniform Guidance also prohibits using federal funds to pay for lobbying activities. There are certain exceptions that apply, although some of those are superseded by the Appropriations Act. And then your award terms and conditions that may come from your state or with the federal agency for Head Start and Early Head Start may have additional terms as well. Kind of two sources of law just to note: the Byrd Amendment and the Anti-Lobbying Act. These are federal statutes that apply beyond community action agencies, that apply to a number of federal grantees and contractors. And so those statutes also have some requirements that prohibit lobbying. The main one that applies to community action agency and the broadest one is found in the Appropriations Act. And that act prohibits activities that are designed to influence legislation. That's the definition that we were using in the first slide. And then I'll say too that in the last bucket, state and local rules, that we're not going to be covering those on this webinar today, since this is a national webinar. But it is critical for you to check with your local attorney, if you're a public CA, to check with your city or county attorney on any restrictions, particularly for public CAAs that may apply beyond the federal grant law and tax law rules that I've mentioned here. With that, I'm going to turn it over to John, who's a staff attorney at CAPLAW.
Thanks, Veronica. I'm going to get into a little bit about what the tax code says for 501c3 tax-exempt organizations, and what the lobbying restrictions related to that are. I'm going to go run through those really quickly, and then have a few hypotheticals for people to consider after doing so, because I think that could help sort of tease out some of the restrictions that are out there. So, as Veronica said, 501c3 tax-exempt organizations may lobby. However, no substantial part of an organization's activities may involve attempting to influence legislation. And so there's a real focus on what it means by quote unquote substantial. And unfortunately, it's not well defined in the federal statutes or the regulations. And so here's where we get into the substantial part test, the substantial part of activities, and whether or not an organization's lobbying activities, rises to that level of being substantial. And so it's really down to, individual organizations. It's really down to what we call a facts and circumstances analysis. There are no clear-cut rules, as I said. What we do know is that it can be as little as 5% of an organization's budget. However, it could be all over the map. There are various factors that will be considered to determine whether or not your organization has engaged in substantial lobbying. The IRS will consider employee time spent lobbying. Key to point out, volunteer time lobbying also counts towards the substantial part test, even though those volunteers aren't paid. Time they spent lobbying, for the organization does count and is weighed in on the substantial part test. So remember that. The amount of money an organization spends on lobbying, obviously a key factor there as well, and it can also be a factor to be how ongoing or scattered the various lobbying activities are at the organization. So again, unfortunately, no set rules for sort of the weight of all these factors and what sort of combination would rise to the level of what is substantial. It's sort of a fact and circumstances test that organizations need to be mindful of when they're out, quote unquote, attempting to influence legislation. So within this context, an organization can attempt to influence legislation, by contacting or urging the public to contact members of a legislative body, for various purposes of proposing, supporting, opposing legislation, advocating in the adoption or rejection of legislation, ways that organizations can attempt to influence legislation. And then just legislation, what are we talking about? We're talking about acts by Congress, state legislature, local governing bodies, action by the general public, can be in the form of referendum, ballot initiative, or constitutional amendment or similar process or procedure. The violations for this rule, pretty severe, so keep these in mind. There can result in pretty severe penalties. The organization can lose its tax exemption as a result of engaging in too much lobbying. In addition, the organization is subject to an excise tax on lobbying expenditures for the year if it's found to be over a substantial amount. And if that's not enough to convince you, then there could be a 5% tax on lobbying expenditures for the year imposed on managers who essentially oversaw or knowingly oversaw, the decisions that led to these lobbying expenditures sort of exceeding the substantial amount. I just wanted to throw in here as well something that's likely not to be considered lobbying. It relates to one of the slides Veronica showed. Sort of think about it as, the education piece. So a nonpartisan analysis or a report that if your organization does those types of things, analysis, study, research, publication, not necessarily considered lobbying if it's sort of nonpartisan, objective discussion of the issues, sort of a full and fair view of them. So keep that in mind as well. If we go to the next slide, so that was the substantial part test. There's also another test that if organizations, want a little more clarity on the type of lobbying they can engage in and how much lobbying they can engage in, called the expenditure test. It's also called the 501H election. Organizations can essentially make this election using an IRS form, and they can make it, from year to year. It's not sort of the type of election you make, you're always bound by it. You can make it from a year-to-year basis. If the elections are made, and essentially, as it might suggest, it's sort of strictly based on the amount of money or expenditures expended on lobbying. The rules also have specific exclusions from the limitation of the amount that you can spend on lobbying, which would include similar nonpartisan analysis, study, research that we talked about just a slide ago, communication with sort of members of a representative legislative body with no call to action, including in it. In addition, there's sort of self-defense communications that organizations can engage in if a particular piece of legislation might threaten their existence and they need to defend themselves. That's okay. And so it's a sliding scale of permissible activities. It's essentially the more total expenditures your organization makes over a year, the more you're allowed to spend on lobbying. We have that sort of illustrated in the next slide, what that looks like. If we go to the next slide, as you see on the left, there's the total overall expenditures, and then on the right, the amount that may be spent on lobbying, sliding scale, as I mentioned. Important to point out, if your total annual expenditures exceed 17 million, no matter how high you go, you're still only limited to $1 million for lobbying. So be aware of that. If you are, millionaire, billionaire organizations, that's still going to be your limit. In addition, it sort of breaks up lobbying into two categories: direct lobbying and grassroots lobbying. So direct lobbying is essentially attempting to influence legislation by communicating with legislators or employees of legislative bodies or government official, referring to specific legislation with them and reflecting a view on that legislation. Grassroots lobbying, which is sort of attempting to influence legislation by affecting the general public or opinions of the general public with regard to that legislation. There are limits on the amount of grassroots lobbying you can do within that sort of lobbying allotment that you have per year to 25%. So keep in mind sort of the differences between those types of lobbying and the limits on specifically grassroots lobbying within those limits. Hopefully that makes sense. Again, keep in mind, if you take this election, there are still penalties if you engage in too much lobbying activity over the 4-year period or a year. For a 4-year period, your organization may lose its tax-exempt status, which would essentially make all of the income for that period subject to tax. And then if an organization goes over those yearly limits, it would have to pay, just for a year, it would have to pay an excise tax on the excess. So keep those penalties in mind too, if you do elect to take the expenditure test. As I mentioned, we do have some hypotheticals to run through really quickly, as I know we're sort of towards the end of our time, but our 20 minutes, but just wanted to run through those really quickly. If you go to the next slide. So just, is it lobbying to ask members of your congressional delegation to support continued CSPG appropriations and reauthorization? I'll give people a few seconds to think about it. If you want to shout it out in the chat window, you can do that as well. But essentially, looking at this, is there legislation involved in the scenario? Yes, there is. Is the CAA trying to influence it? Yeah, it seems so. They're trying to do that. And then are they contacting members of the legislative body to do so? Yes. So pretty straightforward. I think this is pretty straightforward in that it would be considered lobbying. Moving to the next one, hosting a visit from your congresswoman to show her various strategies your CAA uses to move clients out of poverty and educating her about the services your CAA provides. In the parentheses, you're not discussing any legislation or making appeals for support. So here, think about it for a second. But essentially, here we have a member of a legislative body involved in this scenario. They're coming to your CAA, they're talking to people. But is there legislation involved here? No, there's not. It's essentially an educational visit about what your organization does, about how it works with this particular legislator's constituents. And so it's really educational. There's no bill or amendment or appropriations. And so, no, it would not be considered lobbying in this case. Moving on to the next scenario, writing a letter to the editor, an op-ed piece or a blog post about the impact of proposed federal budget cuts on your CAA and your community. Again, going through the analysis, legislation involved, yeah, we have budget cuts, federal budget cuts. Are you trying to influence others with the opinion piece? Yeah, you're expressing an opinion on what those cuts would do, what that legislation would do. It's very public, it's out there, so both constituents, legislators will theoretically see it. Certainly you're advocating for a position on a piece of what sort of the budget cuts would mean. And so in this case, yes, it would be lobbying, even though it's sort of, you're not directly going to a legislator and talking to them. But yes, it would be lobbying. And then the next one, asking staff, clients, or subcontractors to contact their members of Congress in favor of continued LIHEAP or other federal funding. Just by asking others to do it doesn't necessarily mean that it's not lobbying. You're asking, think about that sort of the grassroots lobbying sort of definition that we talked about with 501H election. And what that means, in addition to sort of, attempting to influence legislation by urging others to do it, you're doing that here. Is that lobbying? Yes, I think that would be lobbying. There's legislation involved, and you're still trying to influence it. You're just doing it through others. So yeah, it is still lobbying in this case.
I will say on this one that recall that individuals can lobby on their personal time, and so if you're asking staff to do this on work time and you're paying them, with federal funds while they're conducting that lobbying, then that would be considered prohibited lobbying under the federal grant rules that we're talking about. However, staff members can, very clearly lobby in their own time, not using CAA resources or funds, and that would be the same for clients who typically aren't paid by the organization, subcontractors again, on their own time.
That's a great point. Thanks, Veronica. If we want to just run through the next slide really quickly, you're putting together a packet to explain to your state legislative delegation the impact of your CAA's CSBG program, including success stories and statistics. This could be a tricky one. There are legislators involved. You're sort of in communications with them with this packet, but there's no legislation involved. It's essentially educational, a packet about your CAA, what you do, and sort of the successes that you're having. And so it would fall more along those lines of educational and not lobbying. And then the last scenario, asking your representative or senator to sign on to a Dear Colleague letter requesting support for weatherization, reauthorization, or continued appropriations. Legislature is involved, legislator is still involved. You're asking them to do something with regard to that legislation. You're advocating for that position, communicating with them. So yes, that would be lobbying as well. And then there's sort of one more set of hypotheticals that Veronica will take you through now.
So this one is just a question that has come up to CAPLAW a number of times is, what if there's a sort of Days on the Hill event? Sometimes community action agencies or state associations might, in connection with their conference, organize a day where board members, staff members, go to the Hill and participate in hearings or other legislative activities. And so the question is, can staff go to a hearing where community activists and staff of other social services providers are advocating for an increase in the state minimum wage? And here we're sort of tipping our hat a little bit by saying no legislation to increase the minimum wage has been proposed. So remember, just because there isn't legislation formally on the table doesn't necessarily mean it's not lobbying, because you can be lobbying for the enactment of new legislation. I think this example really illustrates how facts and circumstances matter. And so the question is, what is this hearing about? Is it to try to persuade the introduction of a bill, or is it community activists, talking about cost of living in the city or in the state, and why it's difficult to make ends meet with the current minimum wage? I think it really depends on what the activity actually is in that hearing. And so if you're concerned that this hearing could be seen as lobbying and subject to the lobbying rules that we've talked about, you have two choices here. One is you could continue to do that and send staff there, but just do it using unrestricted and non-federal funds. That could be a very effective way to have your CAA behind this push to increase the state minimum wage. Or if you don't have unrestricted funds, you could consider, some of the other ways of lobbying that we talked about, and that includes sending board members rather than staff to this Days on the Hill event, so long as the CAA is not reimbursing the staff for the board members for their expenses. That was a really quick fly through of these rules and some scenarios. I saw a few questions come in the chat, and so maybe well, we have this slide which just cites to a few different lobbying resources. We have articles as well as that have been written specifically with community action agencies in mind, and Alliance for Justice, and I'm sure Jen will get into what Bolder Advocacy has, but they have a wealth of resources on lobbying. And then also a lot of the IRS rules that John mentioned are on the IRS's website with respect to lobbying. But while you're looking at that, I'll just flag two of the questions. One is a question about whether staff can arrange board members and other volunteers to lobby on company time? So this is a really good question. If you have board members doing the lobbying and you're asking them to lobby, what about the time that staff members are rallying your board members, potentially training them on the issues or teaching them, coaching them on how to lobby? Is that considered lobbying? I think the safest thing to do is to treat that time as lobbying, and hopefully it's not going to be a substantial amount of time, and that you have one person who is working with board members and volunteers who may be, either distributing information about proposed legislation that you would like board members to lobby on. But we would say that, likely this would be considered lobbying. If you have, staff members who you can have a small portion of their salary paid out of unrestricted funds, we would say that's the safest way to approach this. And then the second question we had was whether volunteer board members, when they are lobbying, whether they can indicate that they're part of the Community Action Agency's board as they're lobbying. And we would say absolutely, to say I'm a board member of this Community Action Agency, or volunteer for this organization. We've seen firsthand, the effects of poverty on our constituents in our community, and that's why we're here speaking out about this issue. That's not a problem. You're not devoting resources of the Community Action Agency when they're making that identification. Let's see. Maybe one last question about letters to the editor or op-ed pieces or blog posts that are written on your own time. John, do you want to weigh in on that one?
Yeah, I think just sort of writing those types of things on your own time with just your your name included and not your affiliation with your organization or anything like that is fine to do. It really would become a question if sort of next to your name or underneath the piece it said so-and-so, member of, or executive director of such and such organization. So personal lobbying, on your own time, not affiliated with an organization, would be okay.
Great. And then we at CAPLAW are always happy to take questions from individual agencies about specific lobbying efforts. Again, because they're so fact specific, it's often easier just to talk through what exactly your organization is looking to do. And we're happy to take those questions, offline. So.
Great. Thanks, Veronica. Thanks, John. We always appreciate having CAPLAW on these webinars to offer their guidance and expertise. That was a great foundation for what we're about to move into. So I'm just going to turn it over to Jen here from Bolder Advocacy, and she's going to go over some advocacy campaigns and how to build those into your programs as a 501c3. Jen?
Excellent. Thank you so much for inviting me. My name is Jen Powis. I'm senior counsel with the program Bolder Advocacy, which is a program of Alliance for Justice. And Veronica and Jonathan, thank you so much for the shout out. Alliance for Justice's program around advocacy tries to help advocates be the best at advocacy. What we always talk about within Bolder Advocacy and Alliance for Justice is maximizing your advocacy, and lobbying is absolutely a part of that. And as Veronica and Jonathan did so wonderfully well, was to articulate that it's in the rules. It's expected that a 501c3 public charity would in fact lobby in order to meet mission. And so today what we're going to talk about just briefly is, so how do we build those advocacy campaigns into our programs in order for us to better meet mission? Ryan, if you can advance. Thanks. So I always like to start off with a little joke, right? I promise I'm not going to bore you to death and just read the slides to you. But the nature of a webinar is in fact visual. And so there'll be some reading. But as you're thinking about your own work, I think what's important to understand, please, next slide, is that advocacy and lobbying they're both advocacy and they're both permitted, but those two words should not be used interchangeably. Because lobbying is the only piece that you need to keep an accounting of, an understanding of the dollar amounts that you're expending on it in order to report that up to the IRS. For advocacy, that should be a general part and parcel of everything that you're doing as you serve your clients in your personal community. And so while Veronica and Jonathan sort of did this first part, the basics of the IRS election requirements, I just briefly touch upon the advocacy pieces because lobbying is really a subset of that advocacy that we're encouraging you all to do and to implement into your programs. We'll touch then upon building advocacy campaigns, sort of the big ticket items that I like to think about as I encourage nonprofits to use all of their tools in their toolkits. And finally, a little bit of targeted lobbying, particularly around board members, because so often board members should be our biggest cheerleaders. They should know our organization and the work that we're doing very intimately, and they can often be our biggest champions. Next slide. So first, a little bit, because I'm unfamiliar with all of the organizations that are on the call, I just wanted to pull it out to make the distinction between 501c3, 501c4, and political action committees, because these terms are often thrown around together, but they are distinct. And so my conversation today is really aimed at all of you that are the 501c3 nonprofits. I recognize from Veronica and Jonathan's discussion that some of you are actually going to be governmental entities as well. But here we're going to focus on those C3s, and the prohibition you can see there in the red on the bottom of the box there. The prohibition is around political partisan activity, i.e. a 501c3 cannot support or oppose a candidate. Candidate work is absolutely prohibited. We're not talking about that work here at all. Today we're talking about the limited lobbying and the unlimited advocacy. And that's the point that I really want to draw out from this slide. If you look at that C3 versus C4, right? Limited lobbying, unlimited advocacy for the C3, as opposed to the C4 can do unlimited lobbying and unlimited advocacy and can do some of that partisan work. We're not talking about that today. We're just talking about the unlimited advocacy that all of you on this call, I'm positive, can do in order to meet mission. Next slide. So what is advocacy, right? Veronica did a great job. She was like, so what is lobbying? So now we're asking, well, what is advocacy? Advocacy is the public support for or recommendation of a particular cause or policy. I'm an advocate for nonprofits to be advocates. And the reason why this is so important is because every nonprofit works in some sort of regulated environment, particularly you all. And advocacy programs can help you navigate that environment and make sure that you understand where your funding's coming from, what can really help you meet needs in your community. I often say educational events don't change policy, right? Advocates do. And an advocate can be every one of your staff members every day as they show up for work. And finally, in fundraising, right? There's more ways to raise money than just seeking yearly grants from foundations, which may or may not be applicable to many of you, but it's still an important piece. Next slide, please. So this slide is again trying to touch upon this idea that advocacy is this big, broad cloud of activities that many of you probably already engage in, and that lobbying is absolutely allowed and is part of the things that you can do as a 501c3. It's just it has a little yellow to it, right? There's a little caution there, only because you have to keep track of it. Again, this is an administrative piece related to your back office. It's not that you can't do it. It's not that you can't tell people that you're doing it. It's just that you have to account for it, as Jonathan so accurately said, with either the 501h election with a full dollar amount or in the insubstantial part test. So if we look at those green boxes, some of the things that were in Jonathan's example and that Veronica gave as examples were excellent, right? Writing a report, doing research, providing that to the congresswoman who comes to your annual event or annual gala event. These are ways that you articulate your needs as a nonprofit and hope that these elected officials remember that you are serving a vital need in their communities every day. Next slide, please. So the caution, though, is as I think Veronica and Jonathan, I like to view them, they were kind of like the bad guys, right? They were like, now remember, this is important, stay in the law. And I'm sort of the good guy side where I'm like, lobby, 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 advocate, advocate, advocate. You can do this, just know the rules, right? And so a big rule, if you think back to that slide where it said no partisan political work, right? No candidate work. If suddenly your staff is only doing something in one particular district and an election is coming up, you need to stop and think. Something's not right there. And that's the caution that I like to share in that Bolder Advocacy and Alliance for Justice. We do trainings on this all across the nation because C3s can do a lot to meet mission, and they should be doing a lot to meet mission, but also recognize that there are constraints because you get this favored tax status. So next slide, please. So now building campaigns. And this could be an hour presentation all by itself. So I will go a little bit quickly here. But what I like to encourage executive directors, program officers, board members, as you're doing your strategic planning sessions, get out the whiteboard and really put down some of, pen to paper on what is it, the campaign that you want to build around. So if you look at that first line in the goals box, right, you'll have your long-term mission-oriented goal. Every single one of you have probably been in board meetings where it's been like 3 hours of, well, what's the mission? What's the vision? How are they different? And wordsmithing, etc. That's great work. That is not how you build a campaign, right? That's your goal, your end-all goal. We want to end hunger in America. But then we have sub goals. We're going to start with kids in a lower income quadrant of 25%, whatever, right? And as we write that down, then we're able to focus our efforts on exactly what we're trying to change in our community and how we anticipate addressing that problem. So then once you've kind of delineated those goals, you go to, well, what can we do? What does the organization itself have to offer? Are we a small organization with very limited staff time? Do we have a large client list? Do we have a bunch of volunteers? Is our board engaged, or is our board a fundraising board where they're, active, but not that active with us when we're doing campaign activities? What other types of resources do we have available to us? And so, just as a shout out, right, you all have CAPLAW. You have a 1-800 number you can call, and they can help you walk through some sticky questions on lobbying. Not very many nonprofits have that. Utilize the resources that are there and available to you in order to help you meet your mission. Next slide, please. So again, with what can you do? What are your resources? Often our resources are around coalitions, key volunteers, super volunteers, or perhaps even key stakeholders. Perhaps you've always had a congresswoman or a mayor's ear because the mayor himself or herself has been very dedicated to the idea of ending hunger in America, or ending hunger in their community, or ending hunger only for school-age kids. Whatever that is, that's a key stakeholder for you. It's someone that you can absolutely reach out to on a regular basis. You won't always tip into the lobbying piece when you're just doing advocacy and talking about the issues that matter to you and why they matter to you. So ask yourself, who's likely to support your work? Who else is working in the space? So many of our problems, we're not alone in the work that we're doing. And is there a coalition available? But also then think through who the opposition is. Who is against ending hunger in America? It's a great question to ask. And it's not always quite clear, right? Is the pie always available and ever expanding, or are there limited resources and there's pushes and pulls? Power mapping for change. And power mapping is kind of an odd word, but what this means is think through who can help you with your solution. Sometimes it is not an elected official. You don't need a new law to help you supplement a program. Perhaps it's a regulation that is getting in the way. Perhaps it's a budget idea that provides more consistent funding to your particular program, which again could flip into lobbying. But the goal here is to think through your sub goals on what you're trying to do to meet mission, and then to think through, now, who actually makes that call? Is it only the governor that makes the call, or is it the city council makes the call? So many of you obviously are in federal funding, right? Perhaps it's always federal, but maybe not. Maybe it actually comes all the way down to your local MPO and how the MPO is dealing with the dollars that it's assigned and distributing it to the local communities within that region. And finally, tactics and plans. And this is where we're going to call out the ones that I've highlighted here. So as you think through your campaign and your program, I often think about building campaigns around 4 big ticket items, right? First, understanding my regulatory framework, the legal side. just understanding how I get the money to do what I'm doing, or how the rules and the laws are affecting the mission that I'm trying to be is kind of the first step. And many of your executive directors are well aware of the regulatory environment that they're working in. Second is people. Organizing your community around this one campaign, understanding how to build networks and coalitions and educate those networks and coalition. You need people to advocate, right? It can't just be the ED all the time. People get tired of seeing the same person over and over and over again. They like to see new faces, new constituents, and understand what it means to the community at large about why your organization exists in the first place. Communications. If you don't tell anybody that you have a campaign or a program, no one's ever going to know about it. And this is often so hard. I used to make fun of marketers, and then I realized that the world is run by marketers. So that's how good they did, right? Initially, is that I didn't even realize I was being marketed to. And finally, lobbying. And the reason I didn't highlight it is because, again, we want to maximize your advocacy. Lobbying is going to be constrained, so you should use it as a target. You use the lobbying when you know that's when you need to make the call. Vote yes on my issue, vote no on my issue, whatever that is. Next slide, please. So first, the legal. And this may be a little bit old hat for many of you on the call, but understanding your regulatory framework, understanding the budget around enforcement. Who gets those dollars and where are they divvied up? So for example, they come from federal appropriations, but they go to the state. What state entity pulls that chunk off the top and then pushes it down to the MPO? And then at the MPO, what agency or committee there is making decisions about where that money goes? And when it finally comes to a city, who at the city gets to sort of decide, right? That's just an example, one I hope is appropriate for your context, what I think it might be. So, and same thing, right? So how does the state play? How does the local play within that framework for whatever campaign or program you're going to aim at? Next slide, please. People. So as Jonathan and Veronica both talked about, right? The board's a big one. Your volunteers, your clients, if you're direct service, as so many of you probably are. But don't forget your coalition members, because all of these people are resources that you have access to that can be a part of your program and campaign in order to solve some problem that you've identified when you've gone through that list that we talked about earlier. Next slide, please. So this one's the board, right? And again, with my cartoons, so many board members act as if they are they're so afraid of public speaking, as if they shouldn't be your #1 champion. And so I often talk about boards having 3 main roles. The compass, right? They're the ones that hire the executive director, and they got to keep track of the executive director. The fundraiser, the board should absolutely be helping with that enormous responsibility around fundraising. Some of this may not apply to you because some of you are completely federally funded or quasi-governmental entities. But still at the same time, as Veronica pointed out, you want to find some of those non-federal dollars in order to do some of this work. And so your board should be a part of that. And finally, the advocate, that's the one we're talking about here, right? The board is your public face for that advocacy. And it's not necessarily personal advocacy. If they wanted to be on your board, it's because they believed in your mission and thought that you must have been doing a pretty good job with it. So they need to tell other people why they think that. And use the same talking points that the ED is using, no matter who they're meeting with. Next slide, please. And so I often like to include this as well. I don't know if there's any board members on this call or if y'all are staff. But you know, most states, and this is a general thing, right? What they ask about, well, what is a nonprofit's board's responsibility? And I know this has a lot of words, but let me just sum it up here, where it's duty of care, duty of loyalty, duty of obedience. And the reason I like to point that out is because you should be comfortable reminding your board that your board has a duty to the organization that he or she is serving on in order to make the most out of that organization. You might not be for profit, you might not be making any money, but meeting your mission is just as important, and your board plays an incredibly important role with that. Next slide, please. And finally, now communication. I always just add this in part because definitions do matter. And it's so funny when you start talking with communications, you know, people are like, well, it's just the flyers, right? It's just the mail outs, and it's everything. And in today's world, there's more forms of communication than I ever thought possible, right? Social media, billboards, banners, holding signs on street corners, sending odd little packages to legislators. All of that is going to be communication and should be looked at as a tool that you can use in order to build your campaign, to share your campaign, to encourage others to join you in meeting your mission. Next slide. So I add this as an aside. I hope it's not going too far off the rails, but Calvin and Hobbes, a personal favorite of mine. You recall that there was a difference between 501c3 organizations, which most of you are, right, I assume, and 501c4 organizations that don't have these restrictions around lobbying, right? And so sometimes you'll get, as an executive director or even as a board member for a C3, those odd phone calls where they're asking you to do a favor. So next slide, please. And remember to focus, as you guys do in your campaigns, as you build your programs, as you build your advocacy out, remember to focus on risk management. And the reason I say that is because you'll get odd phone calls sometimes. Someone that you've worked with for a long time that's an elected official may suddenly ask to show up at one of your events. Focus on risk management, focus on the rules of the game that Veronica and Jonathan so wonderfully put together, and focus on meeting your own mission and your own campaigns and your own programs. And if you do that, you know, 99% of the time, you're going to be on the right side of these restrictions related to lobbying. Final slide. So what role should the board play in advocacy, right? Every single role. And then final slide. And so this is our 1-800 number for technical assistance. Again, you all have CAPLAW available for some of these same things, but know that our organization does free webinars, has lots of materials on its website. I encourage you to go there. We also have state-specific stuff. So as Jonathan and Veronica talked about, if you build a program and you know you're going to lobby and you know that it's going to be during the legislative session at this amount of time, you know, do you have to register? There's, as a lobbyist, for example, there's stuff on there that will help you, and of course CAPLAW can help you as well. I'm going to turn to my chats to try to answer any questions, but I just want to thank you again for this wonderful opportunity to talk with you all, and to encourage you once again to maximize your advocacy. Do as much as you can to protect your programs and build your communities. So thank you.
Thanks, Jen. That was such a great presentation. Thank you so much for joining us. I just want to make a couple of really quick points before we move on to a couple of closing slides and then some questions. You know, I think that one thing that I love that you brought up is that there's so many possibilities of things that you can be engaged in your community while still obviously staying within the rules and guidelines. There's just so many different ways to get involved. And, you know, I'm going to do a shout out to Allison Malouf, who's the general counsel of CAPLAW. And often she brings something up that I think is so important, which is the thing that you brought up about risk mitigation, and just the sense that, you know, obviously we have these like core rules about lobbying and all the things that you're allowed to do during advocacy, but ultimately it's a sort of like a choice for each organization to make on their own about how far they want to go, how hard they want to push, you know, so that's just something to keep in mind. These are some next steps. So a couple of weeks ago or last week, the network sent out a coronavirus relief legislation call to action. So when we send out these slides, these links here will bring you to, there's a script there, find your member of Congress. We also put a chart together comparing some of the provisions in the HEROES Act to some of the Senate provisions that came out in the HEALS Act. And then I just wanted to touch on voter registration. We did a voter registration webinar back in July, so that recording and those slides are linked here. CAPLAW has an amazing sort of like 1 to 2 pager about voter registration do's and don'ts, specifically for community action. And then I don't know if Lindsay's on, but Lindsay, do you want to talk about some of these materials that you have here?
Yes, for sure. Yes, you have not lost me. So right now, the image on the right-hand side, the Take Action, is a one-pager that we put together. We're putting more information on the back that'll link to some voter registration materials and some links. I know we talked about voter registration last week, or last month rather. It's crucial that we push this as a network. And because of the work that CAPLAW did with us last month, we all know that you can encourage, first of all, your staff to register to vote without any ramifications. There are no limits on what speech you can have with that. And you can encourage your customers to register to vote and then take action to vote. This election in the fall is crucial for our community, and we really need people out there. The caveat with registering to vote is that you cannot use CSBG funded materials. So I was heartened that I've gotten a couple of people reaching out to me asking some clarification questions. You should come to me first, and then I'll go to CAPLAW when I don't know the exact answer. But please do continue to ask us those questions. You can post things on your website about voter registration. You can post things on Facebook about voter registration. You just cannot be partisan in that quest at all, which is the same as the advocacy and lobbying rules that we just discussed. And you have to be equal opportunity. You can't tell just people you think support your candidate to register to vote. You have to tell everybody, and it can't be CSBG funded. But we will be creating additional materials. My goal is to be able to tell each state what your rules and what your deadlines are. Some of those rules and deadlines get a little muddy because it says something like 3 weeks before election day. So there's calculation involved, but we're trying really hard to push that out for every single state. So you all know what the last day for you to register will be, what the last day to request an absentee ballot will be, and some best practices in voter protection. So look for that in this space.
Great. Thanks, Lindsay. I also just want to point out before we get to questions real quick, here we have the webinar series for the voter registration. You can watch the recording. You can watch the recording for this webinar as well at this link, which is going to be sent out. And then we have 2 additional webinars, the census and redistricting in September, and then voting rights in October. So we can open it up for questions. I don't think we have anything in the chat right now. I just want to touch really quickly again on something else that's really important that Jen referenced, is the tie back to mission. And even though everyone has their own, sort of like mission or strategic vision as an organization, all of us have something in common, which is that the way that this network was set up, the mission of the entire network involves advocacy. So it involves reaching out to your community. It involves mobilizing resources. Those are written into the documents that created this network from the beginning. So even if there's nothing in a particular organization's mission that relates directly to advocacy, that's sort of existent for all of us. It's sort of implied in our mandate. So I just wanted to bring that up again. Lauren, do we have any other questions for Veronica, John, or Jen in the chat? I don't really see anything.
I think the only one here was, and if I'm understanding the scenario right, and John or Veronica, you may want to take it as well, but it looks like the governor secured additional funding for fresh produce and gave it to one of the nonprofits on the call to distribute, but then wanted to have a letter in those boxes saying that, it was basically from his office. So if the nonprofit is in receipt, right, it's not lobbying. The nonprofit didn't, there are probably more facts that we would need to know for that one, but Jonathan or Veronica, I'll turn it to you on that.
That's right. Yeah, we would say that this isn't lobbying. If you're distributing the food to your constituents with that letter, it's really just an acknowledgement of the funding source for that produce box. In some ways, no different from saying, USDA provided the food that your community action agency is distributing. We're thinking about lobbying. Now, again, you can't then tell people to go and vote for this governor in a re-election because they provided food to your agency and to your community. That would be the prohibited partisan political activity that Jen referenced earlier, that nonprofits are not allowed to engage in at all. But simply passing on the food box would be fine.
And that's why I wanted to add those couple slides. Sometimes, and I hope those that are participating here, I hope I didn't confuse the issues too much. When the lawyers start talking 501c3 and 501c4, and, sometimes executive directors are like, just tell me what I can and can't do. That's all I want to know. And we definitely understand that. But the reason I bring that up, and this is kind of a good example, because if you've had an elected official who has been your champion, who shows up and does tours of your facility where you're providing food, etc. But then they call you during an election year, right? It's up to you to understand the rules. It's up to you to protect your C3 status. It's up to you to utilize the resources you have on this call. Call CAPLAW, call Lindsay, call Ryan, whoever it is, to make sure that you're comfortable with what you're doing and when, because elected officials are notorious for putting you in odd situations sometimes.
Absolutely. So here we just have some contact info, like everyone has said basically on the call. Certainly reach out to any of us if you have any questions. Reach out to John and Veronica at CAPLAW. This is the information here for myself and for Lindsay and Lauren. Also, we have here contact info for Jim Masters and Alan Stansberry at the Center for Community Futures. And we can certainly stay on, just shameless plug here for our annual convention, which is happening starting August 24th, so next Monday. This is a registration link that you can use here, so that'll go out with the slides. I think I see one additional question here. Can we offer education about specific legislation numbers with or without impact without stating position? Anyone want to hop onto that?
I'm happy to jump on, or Jonathan, go for it. Either one.
No, please go ahead.
So I love these because at Alliance for Justice with Bolder Advocacy, remember we have that 1-800 number, and sometimes this is, just a quick phone call. I'm going to give you the good lawyer response, and it depends, because if you had not elected under 501H, right, any education you push out, if it talks about a bill, will be considered lobbying. And so that facts and circumstances test would apply around whether or not it's a substantial or insubstantial part. If you have made that 501H election and you put out education about a variety of bills with no call to action, and it's an annual report that you routinely do every legislative session, it is likely not lobbying, because you've not done a call to action to any constituents, your members, to say, go tell them to vote a certain way. And you haven't, as a staffer, gone into an office and said, I don't like, or I do like, or something like that. That's the IRS side. I would turn to Veronica and Jonathan on the particular federal restraints on, it depends what kind of organization you are, and what funding stream you were doing related to that. I guess I would guess would be also a part of that equation.
Right. So I think under the federal grant rules, you'd have to think about, one, I think you would have to do a fairly comprehensive education around all the legislative pieces. You can't just pick and choose the ones that are going to be most beneficial to your organization and to your, to the programs that you operate, which can be tricky, depending on the legislative session that you're trying to cover and how many bills you'd be expected to try to summarize. Oftentimes there is another organization in your community that might be doing that, and maybe even the sort of county or city elections department, or that would prepare some sort of summary of bills. And so I think one is to figure that out, whether or not that effort has already exists in your community. I think if the purpose of this is purely education and getting people involved in the sort of legislative process in your community, you could try to make the argument that it's not lobbying in this from a federal grant perspective, and that it's not designed to influence the enactment of or modification of legislation. I think it's risky, again, because it's going to be hard to cover every single bill that's out there. And if you're seen as cherry picking bills, that will be seen as taking a non-neutral position potentially.
Yeah.
Summary, Veronica, because it, again, as Jonathan so wonderfully put, right, it is this facts and circumstances, and recognize, right, it's not like a gotcha game. The IRS wants you in compliance. It's not trying to catch you doing something. But here, if you have a newsletter that you always push out and it's a rolling thing on any bill that goes to the Public Health Committee, for example, and you kind of give a little snippet, probably fine, right? It's education. You're letting people know that the legislature is seeing it. If you never do this and all of a sudden only talk about free, to Veronica's point, well, maybe you should call CAPLAW.
Yeah. Great. Well, it looks like we don't have any additional questions here in the chat. Again, please feel free to reach out to any of us, to me or Lindsay at the partnership, or John or Veronica at CAPLAW. Call the CAPLAW hotline. You can call the Bolder Advocacy hotline. Any questions at all, please let us know. Or even for me, if it's anything policy related, because I also do policy work, please let me know if you have questions about anything policy related. Just let me know. And I guess that does it for us. So thank you so much for attending. We're going to send out these slides and the recording, obviously. Thank you so much to Jen and to John and Veronica for joining us. And hopefully we'll see you all at the webinar that we're doing in September.
Thank you.